Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the remote cabin in the distance. She had been planning this solo trip for months, eager for a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. She inhaled the crisp, fresh air and smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She made her way towards the cabin, her backpack heavy with supplies. As she approached, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cabin was old and decrepit, and there was an eerie silence that hung over the woods. But Sarah was determined to push aside her fears and enjoy her trip. She unlocked the cabin and stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the interior. It was musty and dark, but Sarah was pleasantly surprised to find that it was also cozy and comfortable. She unpacked her belongings and set to work making the cabin her home for the next few days. As Sarah settled in, she heard a strange noise coming from outside. She cautiously peered through the window, but all she could see was the dense forest. She shrugged it off and continued with her evening routine. But the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Something was not right, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Sarah tried to ignore the strange events, but as the night went on, she became increasingly aware of the cabin's dark history. She was no longer alone in the woods, and the fear was starting to take hold. The arrival at the cabin marked the beginning of a journey that would challenge her perceptions of reality. Determined to uncover the mystery of the cabin and its past, Sarah dug through the old books and papers she found in a chest under the bed. She came across old newspaper articles and yellowed journals, all detailing a disturbing history of violence and madness associated with the cabin and its former owner. Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling of unease as she read through the articles, her mind imagining the horrors that must have taken place within the walls of the cabin. The more she read, the more isolated she felt as the fear began to grip her heart. The thought of spending the night alone in the cabin now filled her with dread, and she found herself constantly checking the locks on the windows and doors. The shadows seemed to stretch and creep towards her as the sun set, and the sounds from outside grew louder and more persistent. Sarah felt herself becoming more and more vulnerable with each passing moment, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her in the darkness. As she lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of the cabin's history and the unknown dangers that surrounded her, Sarah realized that she was in for a long and sleepless night. And as the night wore on, the fear and uncertainty reached their peak as Sarah grappled with the reality of her situation. Sarah had been exploring the cabin for hours, searching for any clues to its dark past. The more she delved into its secrets, the more she realized that she was in over her head. The hidden rooms, cryptic notes, and eerie objects only added to her unease. By now she was in the basement, rummaging through old boxes, when she found it. A door, hidden behind a bookshelf, led to a secret room. The musty smell that greeted her as she pushed open the door was the least of her worries. The room was small, cramped, and sparsely furnished. Sarah's heart raced as she gazed around the room, taking in the details. A single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling provided the only source of light. The walls were covered in faded newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. They were articles about violence, murder, and madness, all related to the cabin and its mysterious owner. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that she was not alone. Footsteps echoed through the cabin, growing louder with each passing moment. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or make a sound. The night was black as coal, but the full moon shone through the cabin's windows, illuminating the room where Sarah was hiding. Her breaths were short and rapid, her heart beating like a drum. The sound of footsteps approached, slowly and deliberately. Sarah realized she could not run anymore. She had to face her fear, confront the intruder, and fight for her life. She braced herself and stood up, facing the door. The footsteps stopped. Sarah's hand was shaking as she reached for the lamp, but before she could turn it on, a hand grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her into the darkness. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The intruder didn't answer. Instead, they pulled her towards the main room. The moonlight was the only source of light, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. In the center of the room, Sarah saw a figure dressed in all black, their face obscured by a hood. "You've been following me," Sarah said, her voice firm. The intruder nodded, a sinister grin on his face. "Why?" Sarah asked, her fear turning into anger. "You should not have come here," the intruder said, their voice deep and menacing. "Who are you?" Sarah said, her voice rising. The intruder stepped forward, and the moonlight revealed a face scarred and twisted with madness. Sarah screamed. But before she could run, the intruder grabbed her. "You will never leave this place," the intruder said, his grip tightening. Sarah refused to give up. She used all her strength to break free from the intruder's grip and grab a nearby chair. She swung it at the intruder, but the man dodged it with ease. Aggravated, the intruder grabbed Sarah by the throat, lifting her off the ground. "You should have never come here," he repeated, the grip becoming tighter. Sarah was losing consciousness. She closed her eyes, prepared for the end, when she heard a loud noise coming from outside. The intruder released her, and Sarah fell to the ground, gasping for air. The intruder ran towards the door, brandishing his gun and vanishing in the thick woods. When Sarah stumbled outside, she saw an elderly man in hiking gear. "Help!" Sarah screamed, running towards him. "Are you okay?" the man asked, extending a hand to help Sarah. Sarah nodded, still in shock, tears streaming down her face. "Let's get out of here," the man said, his voice steady. Sarah stumbled out of the cabin, her heart racing and her legs shaky. She breathed in the fresh air, grateful to be alive. She had been held captive in the cabin for what felt like an eternity, and now, finally, she was free. The cabin, that was supposed to be a place of peace and solitude, now held nothing but fear and darkness for her. As she walked down the dirt road leading away from the cabin, Sarah tried to make sense of what had happened. She thought about the mysterious owner of the cabin, who had been watching her every move. She shuddered at the thought of the hidden rooms and the macabre objects she had discovered. It was all too much to process. The journey back to civilization felt like an eternity, but finally, Sarah made it to her car. She sat in the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she tried to start the engine. But the moment she heard the car come to life, she broke down into sobs. The overwhelming relief and gratitude to be alive washed over her. Sarah returned to her life, but she was no longer the same person. The experience at the cabin had changed her, leaving her scarred and haunted. The memories of her time at the cabin followed her wherever she went, and she found it hard to shake them. She was constantly looking over her shoulder. She arrived back at her apartment, still dazed and shell-shocked. She locked the door behind her, finally feeling safe. She walked over to her couch and collapsed onto it, exhausted. Sarah closed her eyes, taking deep breaths. She could still smell the musty, damp air of the cabin. She could still feel the cold, hard floor beneath her as she crawled to escape. She could still hear the footsteps of the intruder echoing through the cabin. But as she sat there, trying to gather her thoughts, Sarah realized that there was something she had overlooked. Something she had found in the cabin, buried deep in the darkness. She got up from the couch and walked over to her kitchen. She opened a drawer and pulled out the small, worn journal she had found in the cabin. She opened it, staring at the pages filled with scribbles and notes. She started to read, and as she did, a chill ran down her spine. The notes were written by the previous owner of the cabin, and they told a story of madness and violence. A story that was far too similar to Sarah's own experience. And as she read on, she came across a final entry. It read, "I have been watching you, Sarah. I have been watching you since you first arrived at the cabin. I know what you have seen, and I know what you have done. And now I will claim what is rightfully mine."
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to stay tuned for more true stories.